The man left his boots on the platform. That was the first thing Tallulah Pierce noticed. Not the crowd that had gone quiet when she stepped off the stage, not the two men near the livery who stopped talking and looked away the moment she descended the iron step. Not even the absence of the person who was supposed to be standing there to meet her. She noticed the boots. Brown leather badly resoled at the toe, sitting side by side at the edge of the platform boards, as though their owner had simply stepped out of them, and kept walking in his stockings in whatever direction presented itself. She set her traveling case down beside her left foot, and looked at them. Then she crouched and pressed 2 fingers against the sole of the left boot. Still warm. Not from the sun, the platform was in shade, and the boards beneath the boots were cold. Warm from a foot. From 30 minutes ago, maybe less. She picked the boot up, turned it over in her hands. The leather along the upper was cracked at the flex point, repaired twice with different thread. The inside bore the permanent shape of a man's heel. She set it back down, exactly as she had found it. The toe pointed south. The right boot angled very slightly outward, the way feet fall when a person stands still and relaxed. She stood back to her full height. Every person in view found somewhere else to be. The station master was moving toward his ticket window with his back already turned, his shoulders set in the posture of a man who has decided not to see something. A woman on the far side of the street turned into a doorway she had not been walking toward, too sharp, too sudden the pivot of someone changing course. A boy who had been sitting on a barrel watching the stage come in dropped off the back of it without being called and disappeared around the building corner. A man in a gray coat near the feed store ran his thumb along the brim of his hat and looked at the sky. Tallulah had been in Dustfall Ridge for 4 minutes. She picked up the traveling case and crossed to the ticket window. The station master kept his back to her and made a deliberate show of organizing papers he had already organized. Stack them left square, the corners move them right, square the corners again. She stood and waited. He had the stiff-necked patience of a man who believed that if he could simply outlast the uncomfortable thing would eventually leave. Conrad Bell, she said. He was to meet this stage. Drowning accident. He did not turn. Terrible thing. She watched the back of his collar. He had used those exact words without asking who she was or why she was asking. He had not said, "I'm sorry for your loss," which a man says when he is speaking to a person. He had said drowning accident. Terrible thing. A prepared statement. When, she said. Last week. He picked up one of the already organized stacks and moved it 6 inches to the left. Sheriff handled it. Records are over there if you need them. She walked back to the platform and stood with her shadow falling long behind her. The woman who had turned into the doorway had come back out of it. She crossed to a woman standing near the dry goods store, leaned in, said something quietly. The second woman glanced at Tallulah and looked away. The exchange took 3 seconds. Drowning accident. Terrible thing. She had heard those words already. Not from the station master. From the woman at the far end of the street before Tallulah had asked anyone anything. She had been standing near the stage wheel, watching the passengers descend. And when Tallulah's foot hit the step, the woman had turned to the person beside her and said those 2 sentences quietly, as if reminding herself of something she was supposed to say. Same words, same pause before terrible. A town learns its lines from somewhere. Tallulah stood in the shade of the platform roof with the traveling case at her side and gave the street another 30 seconds. Nobody came to meet her. Nobody offered help. The boots sat where she had left them and nobody asked about them. She picked up the case and walked toward the boarding house. Martha Spate ran the boarding house on the north end of the main street. 2 stories white paint going to gray from the bottom up where the dust hit it in the afternoons. A front porch with 2 chairs that had been sat in unevenly, the right one more worn than the left. The cushion flattened on that side. A smell of bread and something with onions came through the screen door before Tallulah had her hand on the latch. Martha opened it herself, which meant she had been watching the street. She was a round-faced woman in her mid-50s, with quick dark eyes, and the kind of directness that comes from years of running a house full of strangers. She looked at Tallulah from boots to crown, steady without flinching or compensating. This was more than most people managed. Martha simply looked, and then stepped back to make room. "Room's on the 2nd floor," she said. "Corner. Better light in the mornings." She led the way upstairs, without waiting to be thanked. The stairs were uncarpeted pine, solid underfoot. The room was at the end of the hall. Clean plain. A bed with a white cover. A wooden dresser, a chair by the window. The window faced east. On the floor was a braided rug in faded blues, sitting slightly off-center from the dresser, whose feet had pressed 4 even grooves into the floorboards. She set the traveling case on the chair and looked at the rug. The grooves ran north of center about 3 inches. The rug's near edge ran south of them. The displaced look was recent. The rug's edges lay flat in their new position, without the slight curling that comes from long-settled furniture. "Supper's at 6, Martha said from the doorway. "I'll need you down by 1:30 or it goes cold." "Fine." Martha did not move immediately. She looked at the case, then at Tallulah, with the expression of a woman arriving at a decision she'd been turning over for a while. "Conrad Bell was a good man," she said. "Whatever troubles come of this, it's not your fault." "No one said it was." Martha touched her apron pocket, a quick, habitual motion, flat of the hand, and dropped it just as quickly. "No," she said. "No, they haven't." She went back downstairs. Tallulah sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the displaced rug. She did not move it. She made a note in the small notebook she carried in her jacket pocket. Then she went to the window and looked at the street below, at the platform 3 blocks south, where the boots were still sitting, and at the long western light laying a band of gold along the dirt. Victor Galloway was already at the supper table when she came down. He had the look of a man who was always already somewhere, napkin on his knee, a glass of water poured, the butter dish within reach. He was perhaps 60, with silver-gray hair combed back precisely, and the careful bearing of a man accustomed to representing interests larger than his own person. He introduced himself as a land assessor from Austin, without standing. "Miss Pierce," he said when Martha brought the breadboard. Not a question. She had not introduced herself to anyone in Dustfall Ridge. The station master had not used her name. Martha had not used her name. "Mr. Galloway. Terrible business about Bell." He broke a piece of bread without looking at it. "I hope the situation doesn't leave you in too difficult a position. The Meridian Agency in Abilene handles these arrangements so poorly in my experience." She had not mentioned the Meridian Agency. She had not mentioned Abilene. "Manageable," she said. She passed the breadboard to her left and decided not to ask how he knew. He talked through supper land prices, drought, a case in San Angelo, and she answered with enough substance to avoid seeming evasive, and not enough to give him anything. He seemed satisfied with her answers in a way that made her think they confirmed something he had already believed. She went upstairs and decided to say less than she knew, which at this point was very little. But the rule would hold. She went to the post office the morning after arriving, before the street was fully awake. The light was flat and low, and the dust still lay where it had settled the night before without wind to lift it. The post office opened at 7:30, and the postmaster was still unlocking when she arrived. "Bell's incoming mail for the past week," she said. "I'd like to see it." And he was a thin man, with a tidy mustache, and the air of someone who had recently been told something that made ordinary interactions feel complicated. He looked at her. He looked at his keys. He looked at the door he had just unlocked. "Can't release another person's correspondence," he said. "Sorry for your trouble." She thanked him and walked back to the boarding house. In Martha's kitchen, she bought a sheet of paper for 2 cents and sat at the kitchen table and wrote out a formal request in careful, clear hand, her name, the date, the grounds. That she had traveled under written correspondence from Bell, that she had arrived to find his circumstances unexplained, that she was attempting to settle her affairs accordingly. She went back to the post office at 8:15. 3 men were inside. She walked to the counter and placed her written request beside the public ledger the postmaster kept for official inquiries. She dated it. She wrote her name clearly. She entered the request number. She capped the pen and left the ledger open on the counter. The postmaster stood with both hands on the counter and did not speak. "I'll come back tomorrow for a response," she said, and left. He had been told to refuse her. The instruction had come before she arrived, or within hours of it. Both meant the same thing she had been anticipated. She wrote that down, too. The general store opened at 7. She went on the second morning while the shelves still smelled of the night's stillness. She bought crackers and coffee and asked about provisions for a short journey, the kind of question a stranded woman asks when she is working out what to do next. While the clerk was measuring, she rested her hand on the counter near the public register and read it without appearing to. Conrad Bell. Last purchase dated the morning of his disappearance. 2 tins of peaches, a quart of lamp oil, a length of rope, 12 feet. She walked out onto the board steps and stood in the morning heat. Lamp oil and rope were provisions. Peaches were a preference. A man leaving everything behind doesn't carry peaches unless there's somewhere he's going, and someone or something waiting at the other end of it. Belle had a destination. She put the crackers and coffee in her room and went to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Nolan Hayes was a lean man of perhaps 40, with the kind of face that defaulted to welcome the way some faces default to suspicion. He came to meet her at the door before she reached it, which meant he had been watching the street, too. Everyone in Dustfall Ridge watched the street. He held the door. He offered her the chair across from his desk. He produced the drowning report without being asked, laid it flat between them, and stepped back to give her room. It was a clean document, properly formatted, appropriately detailed, signed, and sealed. She read it carefully. The language was exact report of accidental drowning, Casa River, crossing Conrad M. Bell date of incident, given notation of no body recovered due to current and depth. She read the filing date. She read it again. The report was filed 2 days before anyone in Dustfall Ridge had reported Conrad Bell missing. She looked up. Hayes was watching her read with the quiet attentiveness of a man who has been waiting for a particular moment to arrive. He had the stillness of someone who had laid something on a table and was watching to see if the other person picked it up. She had picked it up. She handed the report back without commenting on the date. "Thank you," she said. "Of course." He tucked it into the file. "If you need anything during your stay, Miss Pierce, I'm here." She walked out into the heat. A drowning reported before the man was reported missing. Hayes had filed it, or Hayes had been handed it. Either way, he knew. And now he knew that she knew, and he had watched her notice it, and said nothing. An invitation, or a warning. She was not certain which yet. She found Everett Shaw at the livery, working a damaged rivet on a bridle with a small punch and a hammer. He was a dark-haired man, broad in the shoulder, with the kind of quiet that is not emptiness, but occupation. His mind somewhere specific, while his hands did familiar work. There was a bruise on his right forearm, 2 weeks old by the color from something that had not been a fall. She walked to within 10 feet of him and stopped. "Did you kill Conrad Bell?" He stopped working, not startled. The stillness was the specific stillness of a person who has just been asked the exact right question at the exact wrong time. He looked at her. When he looked at you this way, you understood that his ordinary watchfulness was not this. This was something else. "No." He set the hammer down. "How did you know to ask me? You're the only person in this town who isn't performing." He considered this. "That made you think I'd killed someone. It made me think you'd tell me what you actually know." He was quiet for a moment. "What do you need to know? Why you're still here?" "Bell owes me wages. 6 months. I can't take a court claim if I leave." She nodded. "I'll come back." "I know," he said, and picked up the bridle. She walked back up the main street with the sun on the left side of her face and her shadow running long to the right. She had a particular relationship with her own shadow. It was always slightly ahead of her, or slightly behind, and it was always the first thing people saw when she walked toward them, with a good light source behind her. This long prelude, this announcement. She had spent 29 years understanding that people responded to the announcement before they responded to her. 4 miles south of Dustfall Ridge, the Casa River moved between limestone banks wide enough in summer to hear the current before you saw the water. The ferry platform was a weathered structure of oak planks over an eddy pool where the river slowed enough to make the crossing manageable. The far bank was visible from here, low sandy marked with the boot prints of months of crossings. A man could see anyone who crossed. A man could see anyone who did not. The ferryman's house sat back from the east bank in a stand of cottonwoods that dropped yellow leaves in October, even in dry years. She heard him before she saw him, the sound of someone working rope, the rhythmic pull and test of a man checking his equipment, with the unhurried habit of someone who does this every morning and has for 11 years. Obadiah was a heavy-set man past 60, with the deliberate economy of movement that comes from physical work sustained a long time. He looked at her, the way the ferryman of a river crossing looks at all travelers, measuring primarily what her horse would cost in additional draft on the cable. He set the ledger on the ferry rail when she asked without hesitation, without a question about why. "Belle Conrad." He ran his finger down the column, with the patience of someone who keeps records, because he believes records are the honest version of things. Not last Tuesday. Back a page. Not the week before either. Another page. Here, 3 weeks back going south, same afternoon coming back north. Not the day of the drowning. Not that day. Not any day near it. She looked at the river. Low and clear, moving quickly in the center channel, slow at the limestone shelf edges. A drowning in this river, in this weather, would produce a body. Within 3 days, the current moved it. The shallow water bars caught it. She had not needed to know this before this week. She found she knew it now. Obadiah closed the ledger and held it in both hands and looked at the water. "No body," she said. "No body, no horse, no hat, nothing." He set the ledger down and crossed his arms. His horse was stabled at the livery in town the next morning. "I know because I asked. A drowned horse doesn't stable itself." He looked at her steadily. "I've been waiting. I didn't know who to wait for. But I've been keeping that entry clear in the ledger so it would be easy to find when someone came looking." "How long have you been waiting?" "Since the day the sheriff came down here and told me to record it as an accidental drowning." He was quiet for a moment. "I told him I didn't have anything to record. He thanked me for my cooperation and rode back to town." She rode back in the late afternoon on the south road. A mile out from the river crossing, she stopped the horse. Fresh wagon tracks in the road, dust heading east, cutting off the main road onto the creek track that ran toward the county line. The tracks were sharp-edged, made after the morning dew dried, and before the afternoon wind could blur them. 1 pair of wheels, 1 horse. Someone had left Dustfall Ridge today, in the hours she was 4 miles away. She studied the tracks without dismounting. The wheel gauge was standard. The horse's stride was unhurried. Whoever this was, they had not been in a hurry. That was more unsettling than speed would have been. She looked east down the creek track until it curved out of sight in the brush. Then she rode on. Belle was not dead. She was certain of that now. And someone in this town had moved the moment her departure this morning was observed not to run. Not in a panic, but steadily at a walking pace with a destination already chosen. She thought about Galloway knowing the name of the Abilene agency. She thought about who else had been anticipated before they arrived. Galloway was on the boarding house porch when she returned in the chair nearest the step, with a cup of tea gone cold on the rail beside him. He watched her dismount and tie the horse without moving. "The ferry," he said. She stopped at the base of the steps. "You went today," he said. "I thought you would." "What do you want, Mr. Galloway?" And he set the tea down and laced his fingers together. "I represent interests who had financial dealings with Belle. Significant dealings. The kind that don't resolve cleanly when a man vanishes." He paused. "I think you've found something. I think you're going to find more. And I think there's a version of this where we're useful to each other. What do you have? Access to Austin, to the kind of federal inquiry that can compel testimony and bind a warrant." He looked at the porch boards. "To certain knowledge about where Belle may currently be located. And you need something from me. Independent documentation, gathered by someone with no prior financial interest." He looked up. "Which is you, Miss Pierce, whether you plan to be or not." She stood on the bottom step. She thought about the wagon tracks on the creek road, about what it meant that someone had moved the moment she was 4 miles away, about the Meridian Agency in Abilene, which she had never mentioned to anyone in this town. She thought about being anticipated. "I'll think about it," she said, and went inside. She lay the traveling case on its side on the floor of her room and sat in the chair with her feet on it and her notebook open on her knee. She wrote a list. What she had, what she still needed, what it would cost to work with Galloway versus what it would cost not to. She wrote down everything he had said that he shouldn't have known, and everything he had not said, and the shape of the space between those two things. Belle had not drowned in the Casa River. The question under that, the one she had not looked at directly yet, was what any of this had to do with her being here. She went back to Everett the next afternoon, late enough that the livery was empty of other people, and the shadows had come off the east wall. He had a wooden crate turned upside down for a table, and a ledger on it that he opened without being asked. May through November, he said. Every entry. I kept it because I knew he'd deny it otherwise. She read the entries. They were clean wages, owed dates worked, amounts that corresponded to the going rate for a man of his skills. No inflation that would make a court suspicious. He had kept it careful from the beginning, which told her he had known early on that it might come to this. She thought about what that was like working for a man you already didn't trust, documenting everything, saying nothing, waiting to see if you would need the record. It was a particular kind of patience, not a comfortable kind. She turned the ledger to the back. There was writing on the inside of the back cover. Not Everett's hand, something looser, written quickly in different ink. She looked at it. Then she looked at the pen, standing in the inkwell on the livery's side shelf. Black ink. The ink in Everett's entries was black. The notation on the back cover was in brown black, the color a blue-black pen makes when it's been uncapped a long time, and the top ink has oxidized. Belle had borrowed this ledger in March. Everett had said so. Belle always had the same pen. The color matched. "You didn't read this?" she said. Everett leaned over, looked at it. She watched him recognize the handwriting and the ink color in the same moment. His jaw tightened once, then settled. "I let him look at it for 10 minutes, he said, in March, to settle a question about the March work. T. Harlow Millhaven, a street name and a number, 2 counties east. She copied the address into her notebook. She handed the ledger back. He held it a moment before he set it down, not looking at it. Looking at the middle distance with the expression of a man revising a calculation he had thought was finished. "I'm going to need you to be available for a formal proceeding," she said. "Within the week, probably." He looked at her. "Your wage claim will be stronger inside a federal inquiry than in a county court," she said. "The reach is different." "You think you can get that?" "I think I have what it takes to arrange it." Then she picked up her notebook. "Is there anything else in that building Belle had access to? Any paperwork correspondence, supply records?" He kept a box of his own papers in the back office. "I haven't looked at it." "But don't touch it," she said. "Leave it exactly where it is." She walked back to the main street. She had 4 days before Hayes would formalize her status if he was going to, possibly 5 if he was cautious. She needed to be done in 3. The sheriff came to the boarding house the following morning. He came at 10 o'clock formally, with his hat in both hands and the expression of a man carrying something he had not chosen to carry. Martha positioned herself in the kitchen entrance with a dish towel. "Miss Pierce?" Sten Hayes stood in the parlor doorway. He had pressed his shirt. "The county has formally closed the inquiry into Mr. Bell's drowning. I'm here to convey that to you, and to ask that you conclude whatever personal business you have here, and allow the matter to settle. Conclude. The records are filed. The coroner has signed off. Continuing to interview residents about a closed case creates unease in the community, and, Sheriff, you filed a drowning report 2 days before anyone reported the man missing." He was quiet. The hat was still. "I noticed that," she said. "I noticed it while you were watching me read it. I'm fairly sure you intended me to notice it." She looked at him steadily. "I don't know yet what you intended me to do with that. But I'm not going to pretend I can't read." Hayes looked at the floor for a long moment, then back at her. "You have no legal standing in Dustfall Ridge," he said quietly. "Precisely. You are not a relative of Bell's. You are not a creditor of record. You are not an officer of any court or authority. If I were to formalize your status, you would have limited grounds to contest it." He turned his hat once in his hands. "I don't want to do that." "I understand." He left. Bootsteps on the porch steps, the gate latch, then nothing. The instruction was recent. Hayes's hat told her that held too long, turned too many times the handling of the last hour. He had received it this morning. She had gone to see Everett yesterday. Everett had the ledger. Someone had seen her go. That evening, Martha sat with her at the kitchen table after supper was cleared, with the lamp between them and the window dark with night. She had put out a plate of sliced bread. Neither of them was eating. "There's something I should tell you," Martha said. She was looking at the lamp. Everett Shaw argued with Bell the morning he disappeared, in the street, loud enough that 3 people heard. It was about wages. She folded her hands on the table. "I'm telling you this because I think you're a careful person. Careful people should know what they're standing near." Tallulah said nothing. "It doesn't mean he did anything," Martha said. "I'm not saying that. I'm saying there are people who will. She looked at Martha's hands on the table. They were the hands of a woman who had been running a house by herself for a long time, the specific wear of that the knuckles, the dry skin at the outer edges. "Bell spoke well of him," Tallulah said. Martha's hand stilled. "He did. To you. To anyone who asked. Always Everett, this Everett, that. Best man I ever had." She said it in a flat voice. "I thought at the time that it was generous of him." She looked at the lamp. "Now I think about it differently. He was building a record. That's what I think now, yes." They sat with that for a moment. "The promissory note in your apron pocket," Tallulah said. Martha's hand went to the pocket and stopped. "He gave it to you in July. How did you know that? You touch it when his name comes up. You've touched it every time since I arrived. Someone who was carrying a grief would keep it somewhere private. You keep it in your pocket, which means you still believe it might be honored." Martha took her hand away from the pocket. She looked at the bread she had not touched. "He owed me 3 months of room and board," she said. "He was always about to settle it." "I know." Martha looked at her. There was something in it that was not quite suspicion and not quite trust, the look of a person who has been managed before and is trying to determine whether this is another version of that. "Good night, Miss Pierce," she said, and picked up the bread and went back to the kitchen. She went upstairs and sat at the desk and wrote out the full sequence from the beginning. Everything in the order it happened. Not note sequence. She wrote until the lamp needed trimming. Then she trimmed it, turned the wick down, and sat in the dark with her hands flat on the closed notebook. Everett had told her about the argument before Martha had. He had given her the ledger before she knew to look for it. He had told her about the wages when she had given him no reason to. A man who had done something to Bell would not have done those things. She needed 3 more days. Bell's room was at the end of the second-floor hall, the door closed but unlocked. She moved directly to the rug and rolled back the near edge. The board beneath the dresser-side wall flexed when she pressed it with her heel. She found the edge and lifted. A leather folio tied with a cord. Approximately 12 inches by 8. She lifted it and untied the cord and paused. The cord was tied in a different knot from what the loop of the cord suggested had been its original tie. And in the shallow space beside the folio's outline, in the settled dust, was a rectangular absence, smaller than the folio, roughly 4 inches by 3. The ghost of something folded twice and stored there. Something had been removed recently. The dust at the edges of the absence was still dry and fine, not yet blurred by the air. She sat back on her heels and looked at it. Galloway's man had been in this room. He had taken a small folded document and retied the folio's cord and replaced the board and rolled the rug back and done it well enough that a person not looking for the disturbance would not have found it. She thought about the ferry crossing. About the copy a man would make of any document he used as the foundation of his disappearance. If Bell had staged a drowning at the casa, he would have kept a copy of the ferry record, his own record, the last time he legitimately crossed, to prove he had not been on or near the water on the day he was supposed to have died. Galloway had taken that copy. She had the original, from the ferryman's own hand. He was ahead of her in one direction. She was ahead of him in every other. She opened the folio. Financial records 18 months in Bell's own hand. Invoiced amounts inflated by 30 to 40% payments split between real accounts and false ones. The arithmetic of a man stealing steadily. She read every page and made notes. One entry stopped her. March 14th. A notation in the margin beside Everett Shaw's wage record. Secondary liability, if needed, ES. Wage dispute can be reclassified as embezzlement claim. Exposure, 6 months. Bell had not just been stealing from him. He had been keeping Everett's wages in reserve as a weapon, a backdated accusation he could have deployed if anyone came too close. Everett had been carrying a gun pointed at him for 6 months without knowing it. She turned the page. She kept reading. The Harlow letters were practical and cautious. A man receiving another man's arrangements, confirming timings, confirming an address. The third letter gave a date of arrival. 2 weeks before Tallulah's own arrival in Dustfall Ridge. She set those pages aside and picked up the last document. A letter, written by Bell, dated 6 weeks back, addressed to a name she did not recognize in Fort Worth. She read it. She read it twice. She set it face down on the floor beside her knee and looked at the window. The light outside was going copper. Somewhere below, Martha was moving, and the floorboards carried the sound of a person going about their evening in the ordinary way, the sounds of a house that believed itself to be an ordinary house. She picked the letter up and read it a third time. The tall Pierce woman from Abilene. He had written, conspicuous enough to serve. Investigators fix on the rejected woman, they always do. There's a sympathy to it that pulls attention in the wrong direction, especially with a woman of her particular appearance. She will be stranded and embarrassed and visible, and every man in town will be watching the tall, stranded woman, and nobody will be watching the crossing. By the time anyone looks past her, I will be well clear. She had been in his correspondence for 6 weeks before she arrived. He had tracked her through the arrangement agency, had found her name, found her description, found the pattern of rejections and relocations that made her available. He had studied her the way you study a tool before you use it. And then, he had chosen her. He had chosen her because she was tall, because she walked into a room and the room rearranged itself around her, and everyone in that room had to actively decide to look away from her before they could look at anything else. She had spent her entire life being chosen last or not at all, and Conrad Bell had chosen her first, and chosen her specifically, and chosen her because the same quality that had cost her every other opportunity was in this calculation precisely useful. She was not here by accident. She was a distraction, carefully selected, placed. She thought about the station master saying drowning accident. Terrible thing, before she had said a word. She thought about this woman on the street who had said the same thing in the same order. She thought about Galloway knowing the Abilene agency's name. She thought about Hayes watching her notice the date on the report with the patient stillness of a man waiting for a particular thing to happen. Every one of them had been looking at her. Bell had been right about that. What he had miscalculated was what she would do with the looking. She put the letter back in the folio. She stood up. She went to the window and put her palm flat against the glass. The street below was going dark, the storefronts losing their light from east to west. Her own reflection looked back at her partial dim, her face in the upper portion of the glass, her height filling the frame. She looked at it for a moment. Then she took the folio and her notebook and left Bell's room. She knocked on Galloway's door at 9 o'clock after the house was quiet. He opened it with his jacket on, and his expression carefully composed, which told her that 9 o'clock had been the time he'd been expecting her since he arrived in Dustfall Ridge. "I know you searched Bell's room," she said. He stepped back from the door to let her in. She stayed in the doorway. "You took the copy of his ferry record, the one he kept under the folio, not in it." She kept her voice level. "I have the original from the ferryman's ledger, an original in the ferryman's hand which I collected in person." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he crossed to the chair by his window and sat down, and gestured to the chair across from it, and waited. She came in. She did not sit. "I have the financial records," she said. 18 months of them in Bell's hand, showing systematic theft that affected at least 6 people with documented dealings with him. "I have the Harlow correspondence. I have the ferry record. I have the drowning report with its impossible date." She paused. "And I have one additional document that makes all of the preceding material legible, that explains why it was done this way rather than another way, and that establishes the deliberateness of the scheme beyond any reasonable interpretation. What do you want? A formal federal inquiry. Not Hayes, not the county federal authority with power to bind a warrant. You have the Austin contacts." She looked at him steadily. "You also know where Bell is. You've known since before I arrived." He did not deny it. "You tried to get the ferry record yourself," she said. Something shifted in his face. "Not much. He wouldn't give it to you. Obadiah keeps his own ledger, and he decides who has access to it. You needed someone he'd give it to voluntarily." She held his gaze. Someone with no connection to Bell's creditors. Someone who arrived looking like a private problem, not an institutional one. Galloway looked at her with an expression she did not mistake for admiration. It was the professional attention of a man who has just confirmed a calculation. "You need my documentation," she said, "because anything you present independently looks like a creditor settling a score. In exchange, you convene the inquiry. You provide the federal contact. And you extend the scope to the full financial record, not just the assets recoverable to your clients. And the additional document will be presented at the hearing." He was quiet. "If anything in the evidence packet is missing when I open it at the table," she said, "the ferry operator has agreed to testify independently. He has his own ledger and his own reasons." Galloway looked out the window at the dark street. "Mill Haven," he said. "T. Harlow's address. Bell arrived 6 days ago. He thinks he has another 2 weeks. Then we have enough." She took the notebook from her jacket pocket and set it on the table between them. "I'll have the full file ready by morning." She went upstairs. She spread the folio contents across the desk and organized them in order. Financial records first, then the Harlow correspondence mapped against the ferry record, then the drowning report with its impossible filing date, then Bell's contact letter last. She did not draft remarks. She decided only on sequence. Then she sat back in the chair and looked at what she had assembled. 12 days of work, every piece collected in the open in public, with her name attached to each request she had made. She had not hidden any of it. She had not been able to. She was not a person who moved quietly, and she had stopped expecting to be one. She thought about the boots on the platform. Still warm. She had picked one up on the first day and put it back exactly as found, and said nothing to anyone. That was how it had started. Not with a decision to investigate with a habit. With 29 years of reading a room and filing what she saw and staying quiet about it because speaking up required being sure. And she was never sure enough, and the cost of being wrong was always higher for her than for other people. The cost of staying quiet this time had been higher too. She put out the lamp and lay on the bed with the traveling case on the floor at the foot of it. Still fastened. The hearing was at 10. She slept. Everett knocked at 8:30. She was dressed, and the file was in order on the desk. She opened the door, and he stood in the hall with his hat in his hand. First time without it. It made him look younger and less certain of where to put his hands. "I want to ask you something. When you heard about the argument with Bell, what you thought of it?" "I knew before Martha told me," she said. "You told me yourself." He nodded once, slowly. "You reported it to Hayes that morning," she said. "Before noon. You knew how it would look, and you put it in the record before anyone else did." "Yes, that was the right thing to do." Something shifted in his face. Not relief he had been carrying something heavy, and it didn't leave him, but he adjusted the way he was carrying it. He put his hat back on. He looked at the traveling case on the floor at the foot of the bed, and at the file on the desk, and at her, in that order. Unhurried. "The hearing is at 10, she said. He left. She listened to his boots on the stairs, the front door the morning settling back in. She straightened the file. She looked at the traveling case. She picked up the file and put it under her arm. She left the traveling case where it was. The town hall was a wide room with ceiling beams of rough-cut pine and 8 rows of benches facing a table. At the front, 2 men in dark coats had arrived from Austin the previous evening and were already seated at the tables, left side, arranging documents with the efficiency of people who did this regularly and did not find it remarkable. Galloway stood at the right wall. Not seated. She had not expected him to sit. Hayes was in the 3rd row with his hat on his knee and his eyes on the floorboards. Martha was in the 2nd row in her good dress. The station master was in the back corner. The postmaster was 3 seats from the aisle. The ferry operator was there with his ledger balanced on his knee, holding it like a man holding something he has waited to present for a long time. Everett was at the back, standing. She walked to the front and sat in the chair on the right side of the table. Galloway's evidence packet was already there, sealed with a waxed cord. She untied it and opened it and began to sort the contents, and her hands were steady, and her breathing was steady. Receipts, bank records, letters from Bell's Austin investors, the expected materials. She laid them in sequence. Her fingers found a folded letter near the bottom of the packet. Her name on the outside. Bell's handwriting. She had not included this. She had not known it was here. He had placed it in the packet, knowing she would open the evidence and find it in the ordinary course of doing the work. He had placed one final calculation in her hands. The room was still filling. She unfolded the letter and read it with her hands flat on the table on either side. The careful language of a man who knew how to write an apology that contained no admissions. He regretted the inconvenience. He recognized the hardship. He wanted her to know his decision to include her in the arrangements was in no way a reflection of his estimation of her person. He hoped she would find Dustfall Ridge, though not as originally arranged, not without its own opportunities. He had heard from several sources that she was capable. Not one word usable against him. She read it to the last line. She folded it. She put it in the inside pocket of her jacket against her ribs, not the evidence file. She straightened the evidence file on the table. She looked at the first page. The room had settled. The two federal men were ready. She began with the financial records. She presented them in sequence the way she had planned the night before. The invoiced amounts against the real supply costs. The ledger cross-references, the shape of a theft that had been designed to be unnoticeable and had been for 18 months. Exactly that. She presented Everett Shaw's wage record, 6 months, the dates, the amounts, without editorial comment. She noted the March margin notation, the secondary liability entry. Bell's plan to reclassify wages as embezzlement if he needed to. One of the federal men stopped writing and looked up at that. She did not pause. She presented the back cover notation in Bell's hand and gave the address it contained, and stated that this address in Millhaven corresponded to the confirmed current location of Conrad Bell, which she understood to be a matter of existing record by this inquiry. She presented the 3 letters from T. Harlow in Millhaven and read each one aloud. She presented the drowning report with its filing date and the ferry operator's ledger entry. The ferryman stood when she called. It came to the front, laid his ledger on the table, and pointed to the relevant page without a word, and she allowed those 2 documents to sit side by side in the silence without explaining them. The silence explained them. "I have one additional document," she said. She looked at the room. At Martha in the 2nd row, hands folded in her lap. At Hayes in the 3rd row, looking at the table, now, rather than the floor. At Galloway, at the wall. At Everett, at the back. She took Bell's contact letter and read it aloud. The arrangements, the timing, the address, the confirmation of his plan, and then the line about herself. She read it in the same voice she had used for the financial records. Even. Clear. The way you read a document. The tall Pierce woman from Abilene, conspicuous enough to serve. Investigators fix on the rejected woman, they always do. By the time anyone looks past her, I will be well clear. She folded the letter. She placed it on top of the file. She put both hands flat on the table and looked at the room. Martha was looking at her. Not at the table, not at the federal men, not at the letter. At Tallulah. Her expression was not sympathy, and not pity, and not the managed neutrality she had worn since the first evening. It was something older and simpler than any of those recognition arriving late, with the particular weight of things understood too clearly, too slowly. Then Martha looked down at her own hands in her lap. The room was completely quiet, not the held-breath quiet of people waiting for the next thing. The quality of a room full of people who have just understood something and are sitting still because understanding takes time to settle. She pushed the file across the table to the federal men. The federal men were in Dustfall Ridge for 3 days. They took statements from the ferry operator from Hayes, who gave his willingly, quietly, looking at his hat throughout, and who added without being asked that the drowning report had been filed under instruction from a man who had identified himself as a county records officer, but whose name Hayes had since been unable to verify from the postmaster. From the 2 witnesses to the argument in the street. The warrant for Conrad Bell was signed at the Austin district on the 2nd day. Bell was located at the Millhaven address on the 4th day. He had apparently been there long enough to arrange a regular delivery of peaches from the market on the south end of town. When the marshals arrived, he was at the kitchen table with a tin opened in front of him. The newspapers in Austin carried 3 sentences about it. Galloway settled accounts with Martha and rode south on the Austin Road before supper on the 2nd afternoon. He acknowledged Tallulah with a nod across the parlor that she returned in kind. He did not say goodbye to anyone, which seemed consistent with who he was. She did not expect to see him again, and did not think she would miss the not seeing. Everett's wage claim was filed against Bell's recovered accounts. This would take months. Courts moved the way rivers moved by their own timetable. He said nothing about this. He went back to the livery. Martha found the receipt on the 3rd evening when she changed her apron. She stood in the kitchen with her hand in the pocket, expecting the smooth, worn paper of the promissory note she had carried since July Bell's handwriting. His signature, the amounts and the promise of repayment that had become less convincing each month. What she found instead was a different paper, stiffer and official, with a seal she recognized from Austin, and a notation in figures that corresponded exactly to what Belle owed her. Tallulah had arranged it as part of the Galloway exchange without telling Martha, because telling her would have required explaining that she had known about the note from the first evening, from the habitual press of a woman's hand against her apron pocket, when a name came up that she could not stop hoping would resolve itself. Martha stood in the kitchen for a long time, holding the receipt. She looked at it the way you look at something you trained yourself to stop expecting. Then she put it in the tin box she kept at the back of the third shelf, where she kept the things that mattered, and she went back to work. On the evening of the fourth day, Tallulah came downstairs with her traveling case. She carried it in her right hand, which was her habit, 4 years of it, the grip worn into her fingers. She set it on the parlor floor. Martha came out of the kitchen and stood in the doorway with a dish towel in her hands. She undid the clasps, the left one sticky from the damp, the right one smooth and clean, and opened the case. She took out the folded blue dress from the top and laid it across the arm of the parlor chair. Then the second dress, then the black skirt and the white blouse, then the small cedar box with her mother's thimble, and 4 buttons from a coat she had worn when she was 12 years old, before she had grown into the size of herself and understood that the size was not a problem to be solved. She took out the leather roll of her notions kit and set it on the parlor table. She took out the 3 books from the bottom of the case. The heaviest things she carried packed last, placed at the bottom where their weight settled everything else. The case was empty. It looked smaller when it was empty than when it was full. She had carried it across 3 states, and it had always looked exactly right when it was full, the latches barely closing the leather bowing on the sides. Empty, it was just a case. Martha had not moved from the kitchen doorway. Tallulah left the case on the parlor floor open and picked up the books. She carried them upstairs. She came back for the dresses. She came back a 3rd time for the cedar box and the notions kit. When she came down, the last time, the case was still there empty on the parlor floor. She closed the latches left, then right, and picked it up, and carried it into the parlor closet and set it on the shelf beside the spare linens. When she came back out, Martha nodded once very slightly, with the dish towel still in her hands, and went back to the kitchen. Through the front window, Everett Shaw was in the street in the last of the evening light, working on the fence post at the property's edge. He was replacing the base with a new post, sinking it properly, doing the kind of work that is mostly invisible, because when it's done correctly, you only notice that the fence stands level and holds. She stood at the window and watched him for a while. He did not look up. He worked steadily in the failing light, with the same quality of attention she had first seen in the livery, when he had set everything else down and given her the full weight of it, turned fully toward whatever was in front of him. Not divided. She thought that was probably what he was like most of the time in his life, in the work he chose to stay for, when he could have left. She thought about that. The cedar box was upstairs on the dresser. She had not opened it yet. Her mother's thimble was in it, and the 4 buttons from the coat she wore when she was 12, before she understood that the growing was not going to stop, and that the world was not going to accommodate it, and that she was going to have to find some other strategy. She had been finding strategies for 17 years. Tomorrow she would open the box in the morning light, which was what you did when you were staying somewhere. You found out what the morning looked like first. After a while, she went to the kitchen to see if Martha needed help with supper. She did not look back at the window. She had spent her whole life being the wrong size for the room. She had not yet considered the possibility that the room was wrong.